This is where confidence meets reality. I told a British museum guide that America invented modern democracy, and he didn't argue. He just smiled, stepped aside, and pointed to a glass case. Magna Carta, 1215, he said quietly. I laughed at first. Then I stopped. Because no one else was laughing. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't being challenged. I was being corrected by history itself. I was in a crowded cafe in Manchester when a guy heard my accent and leaned over with a grin. You guys must love how we invented coffee culture, he said, tapping his Starbucks cup proudly. The barista froze mid-pour. Without raising her voice, she said, coffee houses started here. 1600s. The guy blinked. Yeah, but we made it big. She nodded. You made it louder. The entire cafe chuckled softly. He didn't back down. No, I mean like modern coffee. Branding, vibe, lifestyle. The barista handed him his drink. We had philosophers debating here while your country didn't exist yet. That landed harder than she intended. He laughed, but it came out thinner. Well, we improved it. She smiled politely. You improved the packaging. He walked away sipping quietly, like the coffee suddenly tasted historical. In London, I watched an American tourist confidently explain to his girlfriend how the subway system was clearly inspired by New York. You can tell, he said, gesturing at the map. A local standing nearby raised an eyebrow. The Underground opened in 1863. The tourist paused. Wait, before New York? The local nodded. By decades. The guy stared at the map like it had just betrayed him personally. He tried to recover. Okay, but ours is more advanced. The local shrugged. That tends to happen when you start later. His girlfriend looked between them, unsure whether to laugh. He forced a smile. We perfected it. The local smiled back, calm as ever. You perfected catching up. That silence after wasn't awkward. It was educational. And the guy suddenly became very interested in his phone. That's the pattern I kept seeing. It wasn't arrogance exactly. It was certainty without friction. Americans don't walk into conversations expecting to be corrected. We walk in expecting agreement. And when reality pushes back, it doesn't feel like new information. It feels like resistance. Like the world is slightly off script. And the more confident the statement, the harder the correction lands. Wait, we didn't invent that? At a science exhibit in Oxford, I overheard a man explaining electricity to his son. Benjamin Franklin discovered it, he said confidently. A professor nearby didn't even look up. He studied it, she said calmly. People were experimenting with electricity long before him. The man frowned. But he did the kite thing. She nodded. Yes. Publicity. The kid looked confused. So, he didn't invent it. Silence. The father hesitated, then doubled down. Well, he made it important. The professor finally looked at him. It was already important. That landed differently. Not aggressive. Just final. The boy looked at the exhibit again, like the timeline had shifted under his feet. The dad adjusted his stance. Okay, but he made it famous. The professor smiled slightly. So did lightning. That ended the conversation. In Edinburgh, I heard someone at a tour stop say, you can tell these old buildings were inspired by American architecture. The guide didn't react immediately. He just blinked slowly, like processing a software error. These buildings are older than your country, he said eventually. The tourist laughed. Yeah, but the style feels American. The guide nodded thoughtfully. That's because your style came from here. The tourist paused. So we copied you. The guide smiled. We prefer the word influenced. The group laughed lightly. Not at him. Just at the moment. He nodded slowly, like updating internal software. That's wild, he said. But it wasn't wild. It was just unfamiliar. And that's the part that hits hardest. Not being wrong, but realizing your version of the story started in the middle. Here's the deeper thing. Americans don't just learn history differently. We learn ourselves differently. We're taught to be the turning point. The moment things became modern, important, real. So when someone shows you that the story didn't start with you, it doesn't just challenge facts. It challenges identity. And that's why these corrections feel heavier than they should. I was in a small pharmacy in London when an American woman confidently told the pharmacist, "We basically invented modern medicine." The pharmacist didn't react at first. Just scanned her items. Aspirin, he said calmly, German. Beep. Vaccines, pioneered here. Beep. Anesthesia, Scottish. He handed her the receipt. You're welcome to take credit for confidence. She stood there, receipt in hand, completely still. She blinked. So, what did we invent? The pharmacist shrugged slightly. Scale, mostly. That answer didn't comfort her. It confused her. No, I mean like real inventions. He tilted his head. You make things global. That's different. She nodded slowly, like trying to accept a version of reality that didn't center her anymore. Then she left quietly, like even the automatic doors felt judgmental. At a museum in Cambridge, I watched a guy confidently explain to his friends how America invented computers. Silicon Valley, he said, like that ended the conversation. A researcher nearby leaned in slightly. The first programmable computer concepts came from Charles Babbage. British. 1800s. The guy froze. That early? The researcher nodded. Before electricity was even fully understood. The room suddenly felt smaller. He laughed nervously. Okay, but modern computers are American. The researcher smiled politely. Modern versions, yes. Foundations, no. That distinction hit harder than a correction. Because it wasn't a denial. It was a downgrade. His friends went quiet. One of them whispered, "So we didn't invent it." He stared at the machine in front of him like it had just changed owners mid-sentence. That's where things shift from funny to uncomfortable. Because now it's not about one fact. It's about a pattern. When every correction moves your country from inventor to improver, it starts to feel like a demotion. Not in reality, but in identity. An identity fights back. Not with facts. With reinterpretation. We didn't invent it, but we made it matter. That sentence shows up everywhere. This is where the story breaks. At a dinner in London, a businessman raised his glass and said, "Here's to American innovation. We created the modern banking system." A historian across the table didn't interrupt immediately. He just sipped his wine. Bank of England, 1694, he said quietly. The man blinked. Yeah, but we modernized it. The historian nodded. You made it more profitable. The table went silent in a very British way. He tried to laugh it off. Same thing. The historian shook his head slightly. Not the same thing. That pause stretched longer than expected. The businessman adjusted his tie. Well, we made it accessible. The historian smiled faintly. Debt usually is. A couple of people chuckled. Not loudly. Just enough. And suddenly the man's confidence felt like it had an expiration date. In a bookstore in Bath, I heard someone confidently say, Hollywood basically invented cinema. The shopkeeper didn't even look up. France, actually, he said, flipping a page. And early British contributors too. The guy frowned. No, I mean real cinema. The shopkeeper finally looked at him. You mean louder cinema? The man hesitated. Better. The shopkeeper smiled. More profitable isn't the same as first. The man nodded slowly, like negotiating with reality. Okay, but we made it global. The shopkeeper shrugged. So did colonization. That landed harder than expected. Not aggressive. Just precise. The guy looked around like someone might support him. No one did. He picked up a book, flipped through it, then put it back. Like even the pages felt biased against him. By this point, I started noticing something else. The British don't correct loudly. They don't argue. They let you finish. Then they adjust one detail. Just one. And that's enough. Because they're not trying to win the conversation. They're restoring the timeline. And once the timeline is fixed, your entire statement collapses quietly under its own confidence. At a train station in Liverpool, a tourist laughed and said, "It's crazy how you guys copied our subway idea." A commuter next to him burst out laughing. "Mate, this system opened before yours." The tourist blinked. "Seriously?" The commuter nodded. "By decades." The guy paused, then smiled. "Okay, but ours is bigger." The commuter shrugged. "That's what happens when you start later." The tourist laughed, but it felt thinner now. "We just do things bigger." The commuter nodded. "You do?" Then he added, "We just did them first." That balance hit perfectly. Not aggressive. Just placed correctly. The tourist looked at the train pulling in, like it carried more than passengers. Like it carried context he hadn't been given. And that's when it clicked for me. These moments weren't random. They were predictable. Same structure. Same reaction. Same quiet correction. Different topic, same outcome. It didn't matter if it was medicine, tech, or culture. The script stayed the same. Confidence walks in first. Reality follows a few seconds later. And reality doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need to. At a university lecture in London, an American student confidently said, "Trial by jury is one of America's greatest inventions." The professor didn't interrupt. She just nodded slightly. "Magna Carta, 1215, she said calmly. The student blinked. "Wait, that early?" She nodded again. "Long before your Constitution." The room went quiet. Not tense. Just heavy. Like history had entered the room uninvited. He tried to recover. "Okay, but we made it fairer." The professor smiled politely. "You televised it." A few students laughed softly. He didn't. Because that wasn't a correction. It was a repositioning. From inventor to broadcaster. He looked down at his notes, then back up. "So we didn't create it." She shook her head gently. "You inherited it." That word landed harder than anything else. In a quiet library in Bristol, I heard a tourist say, "This place feels like the Library of Congress." The librarian looked up slowly. "Ours opened earlier," she said. The man paused. "So, we copied you." She smiled faintly. "We call it shared knowledge." He nodded, trying to adjust. "Right, but ours is bigger." She tilted her head. "So is noise." Then she went back to reading. He stood there for a moment, like waiting for a different outcome. I just thought, he started, then stopped. Because there wasn't a clean way to finish that sentence anymore. The librarian didn't look up again. She didn't need to. The correction was already complete. And the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was final. Like a door closing quietly behind a misunderstanding. At some point, I stopped focusing on the facts. And started focusing on the reactions. Because that's where the real story is. Not in what people get wrong. But in how they respond when they're corrected. Some laugh. Some deflect. Some double down. But the rare ones pause. And that pause is where growth actually starts. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just uncomfortable. At a networking event, a startup founder proudly said, "The internet is America's greatest gift to the world." The host smiled politely. Tim Berners-Lee. British. 1989, the founder blinked. "Wait, really?" The host nodded. "Created at CERN." The guy laughed awkwardly. "Okay, but Silicon Valley made it what it is." The host tilted his head. "Yes. You monetized it." That word hung in the air. The founder nodded slowly. "Same thing." The host smiled. "Not quite." A small pause. Then someone nearby added, "You turned it into ads." A few people laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. The founder took a sip of his drink, thinking. For the first time, he didn't argue. And that was new. Because usually, the conversation ends with confidence. This time, it ended with silence. The last one hit me personally. At a dinner, I said it again. America invented modern democracy. A historian across from me didn't laugh. Didn't correct me immediately. He just asked, "What do you mean by invented?" That question stopped everything. Because I didn't have an answer. Not a real one. Just a version I'd been repeating. And suddenly, it sounded incomplete. He leaned forward slightly. "Democracy isn't a moment," he said. "It's a process." Then he listed examples. Britain. Greece. Revolutions. Reforms. Failures. Adjustments. "You didn't invent it," he said calmly. "You continued it." That should have felt like a downgrade. But it didn't. It felt more real. Less heroic. But more honest. And for the first time, I didn't try to correct him back. Here's what I learned. Being wrong isn't the problem. Staying wrong confidently is. Every correction I heard wasn't an attack. It was an invitation. To see the full version of the story, not just the part where we arrive and take over. Confidence isn't bad. But without curiosity, it becomes distortion. And distortion feels good until someone quietly replaces it with reality. Because the most uncomfortable thing about traveling isn't discovering new places. It's discovering that the story you believed started long before you arrived and never needed you to begin with.